We've got way too much in common. If I'm being honest with you, we've got way too much in the comments. Since I'm being honest with you, who's gonna pay when everything's free? Who's gonna pay me money? Who's gonna pay when everything's free? I wanna profit from you. Who's gonna pay when everything's free? Who's gonna pay me money? Who's gonna pay when everything's free? I wanna profit from you. The takeaway is that wage labor is not the natural state of the world. It was forced upon us, and it's through processes of enclosing and cutting off access. It's cutting the public's access off from things that should be free, that should be collectively owned, collectively shared, for us to self-govern. Localization, decentralization. I'm not talking about blockchain decentralization. I mean democracy. I'm going to read from Oneness versus the 1%. Again, I love this book. I love Vandana Shiva, of course. This book is amazing. And it's hilarious how much she hates Bill Gates, but I also dislike Bill Gates. If you like the movie Don't Look Up, this is how you look up. This book is how you look up. This tells you everything that's going on the planet and how to fix it. For the first time in human history, our common future as a species is no longer certain. In just 500 years of colonization, including 200 years of a fossil fuel age and 20 years of corporate globalization, humanity has done enough damage to the earth to ensure its own extinction. 500 years of colonization did this. Humans been on the planet for thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of years. Didn't mess up the planet. Kept that junk balanced. I mean, think about what's said. It's like, for climate change to not go awry, we shouldn't have, we can't have the climate increase by more than 2 degrees since the Industrial Revolution. We always measure it against the start of the Industrial Revolution. Colonialism. Climate change is the product of colonialism. Yes, I know the climate is always fluctuating. Climate change was going to happen at some point, but it's been sped up dramatically. This is not normal. And she talks a lot about enclosure of the commons through patents, specifically seeds, GMOs. Our common and indivisible freedoms through our diversities are being threatened by the freedoms that the 1% have created for themselves through free trade agreements, tools of mass manipulation, and the enclosure of the commons through patents. The mechanical mind is a privatizing mind. It contributes to enclosure of nature's commons, social commons, and the knowledge commons, promoting biopiracy, while appropriating, pirating, and patenting traditional knowledge. It simultaneously constructs an artificial wall or creation boundary. Traditional knowledge is presented as innovation and invention, and privatized via patenting. When it comes to claiming intellectual property rights to seeds and life forms, the GMO is claimed to be novel, an invention. So GMOs, when she talks about biopiracy, she's largely talking about genetically modified organisms. And what basically happens is that there'll be crops, different crops, that farmers in different countries who has used traditional knowledge for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, to develop crops through evolution that have certain characteristics that make them resistant to dry climates, that makes them do well in more wet environments, that makes them crops have certain characteristics that are very beneficial in certain ways. And what will happen is these corporations such as Monsanto, they will use genetic mapping to try and extract these characteristics and then transfer them to other plants and try to patent these organisms and try to say, this is an invention. I extracted this characteristic from this organism, which was developed over thousands of years, hundreds of years by traditional knowledge, traditional people. We're gonna take that characteristic that y'all developed. We're gonna put it into a plant or something, and we're going to patent it and say, not only patent it and say this is my invention, but then we're going to tell your government to force you to use our product instead of your product. So now that thing that you developed, that you evolved, is now illegal, and you have to use our stuff now. And you have to pay us to use it now. And it even goes down to banning the ability of farmers to save their seeds, for communities to save their seeds. So that's what she means by biopiracy. Okay, this is where she starts to unload on Bill Gates. We tell the story of big wealth and big money in our times by focusing on Gates and his role in destroying self-organization in nature and society to engineer monopolies through mastery, conquest, invasion, and dictatorship by the tools he owns and controls for rent collection, which is his doublespeak he calls innovation. While he has been central to the establishment of the new civilizing mission of technology as a religion, Gates himself did not invent anything. Microsoft Basic is based on BASIC, an acronym for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, designed in 1964 by John G. Keminey and Thomas E. Kurtz at Dartmouth College, to make it easy for non-science, non-math students to use computers. Before the introduction of BASIC, computers required the writing of custom software, which only scientists and mathematicians could do. Microsoft Basic became one of the leading applications in the world, but even the operating systems were developed by others. Gates made his billions through patent monopolies by enclosing the commons of software. The open source software movement began as a response to the patent monopoly. The free software movement is to patented proprietary software what our seed freedom movement is to seeds. Open software, free software movement, right? software as a commons. I mean, think about Blender. It's open source, it's free, and how important that is. I mean, without Blender, I would not have access to 3D modeling. What's Maya, 3ds Max? That's a lot of money. Most people cannot afford that. Gates is now using his economic power to expand his patent empire to the living world, to enclose the biological and knowledge commons through patenting and biopiracy. She says that because Gates is really big into GMOs. And he makes a lot of money through GMOs. And he works with a lot of companies that create GMOs. And then I'm just going to end with this here, because I really just want to drive home, these are the tools that's used to maintain capitalism, the problems of the world. The globe has been taken over by capitalism. The globe has been taken over by colonial rule. Neely Fuller say the globe has been taken over by the system of white supremacy, that there is no place on the planet where you can escape the system of white supremacy. And then what is the system of white supremacy? I say it is colonialism, and that is a system. And I would further say capitalism. Capitalism is colonialism in a suit and tie. And so what are the tools to dismantle the system of white supremacy, of capitalism, of colonialism? Well, let's look at the tools that exist that help it exist. Let's look at the tools that's used by the system that is the system's foundation. What is the system's foundation? What keeps it held up? What are the legs to this thing? Because I want to kick the legs out. What are the legs? What the legs look like? What the legs made out of? The legs are made out of privatization of the commons. In the 21st century, the corporate empire has found new instruments of extraction, with patents and what should be called capitalization being the two most prominent ones. The concentration of the world's wealth in the hands of the 1% is a consequence of patentization, financialization, and digitization of our lives. Moving on to my last book today is called Staying Alive by Vandana Shiva. This book was written in 1999, and this book is just great. It's about what it says, women, ecology, and development. It's about how the term development, when it's used today, is basically neocolonialism. It's a word used to pretty much expand colonial projects. You go into another country and you say, we're going to develop this country. What that really means is we're going to enclose the commons, we're going to create reservations, we're going to privatize the land, we're going to force the government to force the people to use commercials, seeds, and all types of things. This destroys ecology in a lot of different ways, as well as marginalizes women, because women historically and today, most small farmers are women. Most peasants today and historically are women. Women are huge agricultural providers. And colonialism marginalizes them. When we use industrial agriculture with these big machines, these huge monoculture farms and all of that, it's usually ran by men, and it destroys ecology, which makes the women of the local community have to work even harder to feed their families and XYZ. But she talks a lot about the commons in here. Commons as wasteland. This pretty much talks about how colonial powers, through various means, corporations, World Bank, IMF, Western controlled organizations deeming biologically important forests, lands, uncultivated land, labeling them wastelands as an excuse to privatize it and make money off of it. The approaching tragedy of the commons. Recovering 5 million hectares of the commons in India, wow, each year could signal the end of rural poverty and a reversal of the ecological collapse of critical life support systems like soil, water, and vegetation. Yet, the Wasteland Development Program, far from being a recovery of the commons project, will in fact privatize the commons, accentuate rural poverty, and increase ecological instability. In one stroke, it will rob the poor of their remaining common resources, the only survival base to which they have access. The usurpation of the commons, which began with the British, will reach its final limit with the Wasteland Development Program as is. Chhatrapati Singh of the Indian Law Institute argues, "It is evident that till the end of the last century, meaning the 19th century, and in all historical periods before that, at least 80% of India's natural resources were common property, with only 20% being privately utilized. This extensive common property has provided the resource base for a non-cash, non-market economy. A whole range of necessary resources has been freely available to the people. Thus commonly available wood, shrubs, and cow dung have been utilized for cooking and heating, mud, bamboo, and palm leaves for housing, wild grass and shrubs as animal fodder, and a variety of fruits and vegetables as food. These free commons have historically been the survival base for rural India and the domain of productivity of women. With the reservation of forests a century ago, the first step towards the privatization of commons took place. Today, wasteland development constitutes the last step in their disappearance. The privatization of the commons through wasteland development is not an aberration, but an outcome of the dominance of development agencies like the World Bank and their indifference to the needs of nature and vulnerable social groups. For such organizations and agencies, self-provisioning is not economic activity. So remember Michael Perelman and primitive accumulation, which is the process of taking away someone's ability to sustain themselves, to provide for themselves, also called self-provisioning. Here, today, it's still going on. Primitive accumulation is still going on. It is how capitalism is able to exist. It's the only reason it's able to exist is through cutting off people's ability to sustain themselves for free. In 1984, the World Bank wrote up a national forestry project for India, a significant component of which was the privatization of wastelands. This is the World Bank, okay? We think about the World Bank as this international organization that is supposed to be, I guess benevolent. I mean, until you grow up and find out that's not the truth, but the World Bank is a powerful force in the world. It's an international bank. It is controlled largely by the US. And this is how colonialism spreads today, is through these very formal sounding organizations that is like, oh, I can't be evil, I wear a tie, I have paperwork. This isn't a scam, I have documents. You know, there was a whole economist that went and, you know, wrote up impressive numbers and has a whole sheet to tell you how this is going to help your country. And we have business people. We have, look at my briefcase. But no, this is exactly how the devil presents itself, as a suit and tie, briefcase carrying human being from the World Bank and the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, and corporations. Please check out, I think it's episode 6 of 3.5, where I read Economic Hitman. The regeneration of ecologically appropriate tree cover will socially appropriate community control. With socially appropriate community control could help rebuild people's resource base and reestablish their control over the commons. Yet the Wasteland Board schemes will primarily privatize the commons by transferring the rights and control from the community as a whole to the World Bank, private business, and a few local people. This attempt at appropriating the commons is being facilitated by a number of confusions. The confusion between wastelands as commons and wastelands as ecologically degraded land, private or common. So the confusion between, when you say wasteland, are you saying, remember the ecological definition of biologically unproductive, a desert? Is that what you mean by wasteland? It's something that just cannot produce? Or do you just mean wasteland as in it's not making money? That is what the World Bank means, what the World Bank and corporations mean by wasteland in this regard. They're saying this land isn't making money. That's a wasteland. And that definition goes against what it actually is to the people. It's not what's being labeled as wasteland by the World Bank because it's not making money is not a wasteland at all. It is the source of survival for the local people. It's very biologically productive. And to just call it wasteland so that you can actually make it a wasteland by tearing the trees down, making monoculture farms, using chemicals, using all types of things that will actually make it an ecological wasteland. It's grotesque, this whole process. What is the machine? And what is the foundation of the machine? Privatization. Separating the masses from the ability to provide for themselves and community, really. And all of that is encompassed in commons. I'm just gonna say peace and see you next time.